So how do we proceed? There is a constantly changing present, and we explain the present which we experience. We are living organisms, and as living organisms, we only have the present in which we live. And if we talk about history, then we're not going back into history, but we're talking in the present, where we are and where we have historically evolved from. The future exists in the way in which we see it now. Today, in my life, I imagine what I should be like tomorrow, or how I will like to see the future take place, and how I would like to explain my present now as a result of my past. And therefore, I have a projection on into the future. But, having said that, I live in the present. I think today in the present about things will take place tomorrow, but we are here and now in the present, and tomorrow will again be the present. So we want to experience something in advance, and for instance thinking of marriage or an examination, and we deny the present in doing so, but all we've got ultimately is the present. And sometimes we are anxious about what has happened in the past. I might project on into the present, but we explain the future as a result of the past. We explain history with reference to the present. We project the future out of the present, and in the course of life, this future changes and then becomes present, because we find ourselves not in an atmosphere that is predefined, but it exists before we actually get there. The space of our life evolves with our lives. And this again is something that we need to think about.
Ocurre en nuestro vivir como un existir en sí. Son modos de referirnos al cómo vivimos ahora. O sea, todo lo vivimos ahora. ¿Y desde dónde explicamos?
How can we explain that? Where can that explanation come from? Every time we suggest an explanation, we do that against a background which implicitly or explicitly is connected to our lives. It is what we now live, consciously or unconsciously. We say what we're living right now, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. Mostly, actually, it's unconsciously. But if you don't live in a conscious fashion, that doesn't mean that life is alien to us. It's also part of our present. It's the flow of our lives. These are notions which, consciously or unconsciously, represent the epistemological background from which we act. We don't just explain things out of hot air, we always explain things on the basis of a foundation. And that foundation is our notions, emotions, conscious or unconscious ones. That's what we mean by epistemological background or foundation. That's where we are right now. If we explain our lives from our daily routines, from our daily lives, then we won't be making ontological assumptions, and we won't be using explanations, explanatory principles that can be accepted a priori, because these explanations form during the course of our lives. They constitute themselves while we live, and that's because the experiences we make during the course of our lives can't be replaced. They have to be made through living, and that's all we've got. Science, technology, everything that we do or take on board, all that belongs to the present. And that which an actor thinks or does always depends on the relationship they have to that experience. We don't want to use ontological assumptions. We don't want to use assumptions to explain anything. We just want to use the elements that constitute our lives, the coherences that arise from our daily lives. When you introduce a scientific reflection, you'll see that you always refer to some observation, and that observation is always the experience of a certain person. The instruments that person uses is to link experiences to what is being observed, and that is part of everyday life too. So they are not explanatory principles that are given a priori. Under those circumstances, if you explain something, we also reflect on our foundations of existence, our relational foundations. And if we speak of system laws, or systemic laws, then we mean how the system works together, how it functions as a system, and also the effects that happen between different systems components. All that exists in nature. The difference is that we speak of systemic laws as soon as we analyze coherences that exist within that system. And that's what Ximena says. There is nothing local. There aren't any local actions. There's only ever systemic actions. Because even when we act locally, the effects will be felt throughout the system. We can only observe what could happen to the system. And that's why we speak of the systemic and the infinite in order to introduce a certain dynamics into the system. Because if you start from the same systemic foundation, what you have is a recursive system which exists within a matrix of relationships. Everything that is said by an observer to another observer. That's the systemic law that we'd like to postulate. The observer is a person who differentiates something, and they differentiate this by feeling something, even though what has happened independently of him as an observer and his feelings. No matter what we refer to when we reflect on something, we have to realize it always relates back to our own activities, our own actions. When I reflect on something, I am saying this as an observer. I act as a human being by saying what I say. If I say I don't believe something, then again I am an observer, a person saying something as if I stated this independent of every other factor, even though that cannot be the case. The soul of the second reflection, life. Now I'm getting a bit nervous because many people are leaving. Is that because we're boring? But what are we as human beings? Are we living human beings or are we robots? Do you know the answer? Are we robots? Yes or no? How can we find out? How can you know whether that Mr. Maturana isn't a robot of the last generation?